My grandparents left me their entire estate, but my estranged aunt and cousin forged a deed to steal the house while I was grieving. They gave me 3 days to vacate. I didn't argue, I just waited for them to walk right into a felony arrest. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The silence in the lawyer's office was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It was a sterile, mahogany-paneled room that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, a scent that usually brought me comfort in my line of work as an archivist. But today, it only made me nauseous. I was sitting in a high-backed leather chair that felt too big for me, clutching a tissue that had long since disintegrated into white lint in my sweaty palm. Across from me sat Charles, my grandfather's attorney for over 40 years. His face, usually warm and grandfatherly, was etched with a grim, professional solemnity that terrified me more than his words. And to my left sat them, my Aunt Elizabeth and her son, my cousin Mason. Elizabeth was checking her reflection in the screen of her phone, adjusting a stray lock of her overly processed blonde hair. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than my car, yet she looked bored. Mason, slumped in his chair with the posture of a teenager despite being 25, was audibly chewing gum. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tapping away at his phone, the soft click-click-click of his typing cutting through the silence like a jagged knife. As I was saying, Charles continued, his voice steady but carrying a distinct edge of steel directed at my aunt. The last will and testament of Arthur and Rose is quite specific. It supersedes all previous drafts. Just get to the numbers, Charles, Elizabeth interrupted, snapping her phone case shut. We all know Dad had money. We know the house is worth at least 1.4. I've already had a realtor friend run the comps. Mason needs seed money for his crypto venture, and I have debts to settle. So let's just cut the theatrics. My stomach turned. My grandmother had been gone only 2 weeks. My grandfather, brokenhearted, had followed her 10 days later. The grief was a raw, open wound in my chest. I hadn't slept in days. I felt thin, stretched out like butter scraped over too much bread. And here was Elizabeth, their daughter who hadn't visited in 6 years, talking about comps and seed money before the dirt had even settled on their graves. Very well, Charles said. He didn't look at her. He looked at me. His eyes were soft, full of an apology I didn't yet understand. To my daughter, Elizabeth, I leave the sum of $5,000 to be used as she sees fit. The silence returned, but this time it was sharp, dangerous. Elizabeth blinked, once, twice. A nervous laugh bubbled up from her throat, sounding like grinding glass. I'm sorry, I think I misheard you. Did you say 500,000? 5,000, Charles repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. And to my grandson, Mason, I leave the sum of $2,000. Mason stopped chewing his gum. He looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Wait, what? That won't even cover my car payments for 2 months. Is this a joke? And Charles raised his voice slightly to cut them off. To my granddaughter, Emma, who cared for us in our final years with no expectation of reward, I leave the remainder of my estate. This includes the primary residence, the investment accounts, the antique collection, and the entirety of the savings. Total value estimated at approximately $1.4 million. The room exploded. Elizabeth shot out of her chair so fast it tipped backward, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. You liar, she shrieked, her face twisting from boredom into a rictus of pure, unadulterated rage. She pointed a manicured finger at me, shaking with fury. You did this. You poisoned them against me. I shrank back, the accusation hitting me like a physical blow. Elizabeth, I didn't. Shut up, she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. You little leech. You spent years kissing their asses, changing their diapers, playing the martyr just so you could steal my birthright. That house is mine. It's the family home. I grew up there. You haven't stepped foot in that house since 2018. I cried out, my voice trembling but finding a shred of strength. Grandpa begged you to come for Christmas. You said you were too busy in Cabo. It doesn't matter. Mason yelled, standing up to join his mother, looming over me. It's my mom's house. You're just the niece. You're nobody. You think you're gonna keep $1 million from us. Charles stood up then, slamming a file onto his desk. That is enough. You will sit down, or I will have security remove you from this building immediately. Elizabeth was breathing heavily, her chest heaving. She glared at Charles, then turned her gaze slowly back to me. The rage in her eyes shifted into something colder, something calculating. It was a look I hadn't seen since I was a child, a look that promised pain. She smoothed her dress, picked up her purse, and leaned in close to my face. I could smell her expensive perfume, cloying and sweet, masking the rot beneath. Enjoy the victory lap, Emma, she whispered, her voice low and venomous. But don't get comfortable. Daddy might have been senile, and Charles might be incompetent, but I get what I want. Always. She turned on her heel and marched out, Mason trailing behind her, casting one last dirty look in my direction. The door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I looked at Charles, my hands shaking uncontrollably. They're going to do something, aren't they? Charles took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Emma, people like Elizabeth don't accept no easily, but the law is on your side. I looked down at the legal documents, the inheritance that was supposed to be a blessing, but now felt like a target painted on my back. I remembered the hate in her eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was entitlement curdled into madness. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself, I whispered to the empty room, realizing that losing my grandparents was only the beginning of the nightmare. The week following the reading of the will was a blur of misery. I was staying in my grandparents' house, my house now, but it didn't feel like mine. It felt like a museum of memories that was under siege. Every time the phone rang, my heart hammered against my ribs. It was usually Elizabeth, leaving voicemails that ranged from sobbing pleas to vitriolic threats. Emma, honey, surely you know Grandpa wasn't in his right mind. We can settle this out of court. Just give me half the house and we'll call it even. You selfish brat, I'm speaking to a lawyer. We're going to sue you for elder abuse. We know you manipulated them. Mason needs that money, Emma. Are you really going to let your cousin starve? I stopped answering. I stopped going out. I felt like a prisoner in the home I had loved all my life. The stress was manifesting physically. I had a constant migraine throbbing behind my left eye, and I couldn't keep food down. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen trying to force myself to drink some tea when I saw a black sedan pull up slowly in the driveway. My stomach dropped. It was Elizabeth. She didn't come to the door. She just sat there in her car, idling. I peeked through the curtains, my hands trembling. She was on her phone, pointing at the house. Then she rolled down the window and took a picture. The invasion felt visceral. She was casing the joint. She was looking at the peeling paint on the porch not as a maintenance issue, but as a flaw in an asset she intended to liquidate. I grabbed my phone and called Grace. She's here again, I whispered, sliding down to the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets. Did she come to the door? Grace asked, her voice sharp with protective anger. Grace was a paralegal, sharp as a tack and fiercely loyal. She had been my rock through the funerals. No, she's just sitting there, taking pictures. It's creepy, Grace. It's like she's planning a siege. She's trying to scare you, Em. It's intimidation tactics. Don't let her win. Remember what Charles said. I know, I said, picking at a loose thread on my sweater. But Charles is a lawyer. He thinks in terms of filings and motions. Elizabeth thinks in terms of war. You didn't see her face in that office. Listen to me, Grace said firmly. You need to protect yourself, not just physically, but legally. Beyond just the will, have you thought about what we discussed, the trust? I hesitated. Charles mentioned it, an irrevocable trust. He said it would lock everything down so tight that even if they sued me into oblivion, they couldn't touch the assets. Do it, Grace urged. Do it yesterday. Elizabeth is sloppy, but she's persistent. If she finds a loophole, she'll pry it open with a crowbar. You need to make this estate bulletproof." I looked out the window again. Elizabeth's car was pulling away, but as she did, she slowed down and looked directly at the window where I was hiding. I swore she smiled. It was a predatory, knowing smile. "I'm going to Charles's office tomorrow morning," I told Grace, a newfound resolve hardening in my chest. "I'm not just going to inherit this house. I'm going to bury it in so much legal armor she'll break her teeth trying to bite it." The next morning, I sat across from Charles again. I looked terrible, dark circles under my eyes, hair thrown into a messy bun, but my mind was clear. "I want to move everything," I said, cutting straight to the chase. "The house, the accounts, the portfolio, everything into the trust, the Arthur and Rose Memorial Trust. I want to be the beneficiary, but I want the trustee to be an independent entity. I want to own nothing on paper." Charles nodded slowly, a glint of approval in his eyes. "A wise move, Emma. It creates a firewall. Even if they contest the will, even if they fabricate claims against you personally, the assets belong to the trust, not you. It adds a significant layer of complexity to any litigation they might attempt." We spent 4 hours drafting the documents. It was tedious, exhausting work, categorizing every single aspect of my grandparents' legacy. But with every signature, with every initial, I felt a weight lifting. I wasn't just hiding the money, I was protecting their memory. I was ensuring that the home they built wouldn't be sold off to pay for Elizabeth's gambling debts or Mason's failed startups. As I signed the final deed transfer, moving the title of the house from Emma last name to the Arthur and Rose Memorial Trust, Charles looked at me over his spectacles. "You know," he said softly, "this doesn't mean they'll stop coming. Elizabeth isn't the type to check public records before she attacks." I capped my pen, the click echoing in the quiet office. A cold calm washed over me. "I know," I replied, a small, sad smile touching my lips. "Let them come. Let them try to take it." I thought of Elizabeth's smirk in the driveway. I thought of Mason's arrogance. They were so sure of themselves, so convinced that their loud voices and bullying tactics would eventually wear me down. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They were playing checkers, flipping the board and demanding to be crowned kings. They didn't realize I had just changed the entire game to chess, and I had already moved my queen into position while they were busy shouting. To understand why Elizabeth's betrayal cut so deep, you have to understand the history, or rather, the lack of it. For the last 5 years, my life had been shrinking. It started when Grandpa had his first stroke. Grandma was already frail, suffering from early-stage dementia that made her days a confusing loop of lost keys and forgotten names. I was 24, fresh out of grad school, with a bright career ahead of me in the city. But when the call came, Grandpa in the ICU, Grandma found wandering the neighborhood in her nightgown, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags and moved back to the small town I grew up in. I called Elizabeth that first night. "I can't come, Emma," she had said, her voice tinny over the speakerphone background noise of a clinking restaurant evident. "I have a showing tomorrow, a huge property. Besides, you're young, you have energy. You can handle it for a few days." Those few days turned into 5 years. I became their nurse, their chef, their cleaner, and their memory. I managed Grandpa's physical therapy. I learned how to redirect Grandma when she got scared and didn't recognize me. I sacrificed my social life, my dating life, and the prime years of my career advancement. I worked remotely as a freelance researcher late into the night just to keep a toe in my profession, listening for the baby monitor I kept in their room. And Elizabeth, she visited twice. Once for 2 hours on a Thanksgiving 3 years ago, where she complained that the turkey was dry and asked Grandpa if he still kept his vintage watches in the safe. The second time was to ask for a loan of $10,000 because her real estate license was suspended due to an administrative error, which I later learned was an ethics violation. She never changed a diaper. She never wiped a tear. She never sat up at 3 a.m. holding Grandma's hand while she cried for her own mother. So, when she decided to declare war on me, it wasn't just about the money. It was an insult to the love and labor I had poured into that house. 3 weeks after the funeral, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime. It was a persistent, aggressive leaning on the button. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. I opened the door to find Elizabeth and Mason standing there, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them stood a tall, oily-looking man in a cheap suit, holding a briefcase. "Elizabeth," I said, blocking the doorway, "what do you want?" "We're here to inspect the property," Elizabeth said breezily, pushing past me before I could stop her. The man in the suit followed, and Mason brought up the rear, smirking at me. "Excuse me," I said, hurrying after them as they marched into the living room. "You have no right to be here. This is my house." "Actually," the man in the suit spoke up, his voice nasally and condescending. "We are here on behalf of the potential investors. My client, Mrs. Elizabeth, has informed me that there are questions regarding the validity of the will due to the decedent's mental state. As such, we need to inventory the assets to ensure nothing is misplaced." "Who are you?" I demanded. "This is Mr. Henderson," Elizabeth said, running her hand along the back of my grandmother's favorite velvet armchair. "He's advising me, and honestly, Emma, look at this place. It's cluttered. It smells like old people. We're going to need to stage it properly if we want to get top dollar." "We are not selling the house," I shouted, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Get out, all of you." Mason laughed, picking up a crystal figurine from the mantel and tossing it lightly in the air. "Relax, cuz. Why are you so uptight? You're acting like you're hiding something." "Put that down," I snapped. "Or what?" Mason sneered. "You gonna call the cops on family?" Elizabeth turned to me, her face hardening. "Emma, stop being dramatic. You know you can't maintain this place. The property taxes alone will drown you. I'm doing you a favor. We sell, we split it, fairly, of course, considering I'm the daughter, and you can go back to whatever dusty library you crawled out of." "Fairly?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You want to split it fairly? Okay. Let's calculate the cost of 5 years of 24/7 nursing care. Let's calculate the housekeeping, the cooking, the emotional labor. You send me a check for that, and then we can talk about fair." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, invading my personal space again. "You listen to me, you little brat. I know you coerced them. I know you forced Daddy to sign that new will when he was hopped up on pain meds. I am going to prove it. And when I do, you'll be lucky if you walk away with the clothes on your back." She looked around the room with a sneer of ownership. "Mr. Henderson, make a note of the grand piano. I have a buyer in the city who pays cash for Steinways." "Don't you dare touch that piano," I hissed. "Grandma taught me to play on that." "Sentimental garbage," Elizabeth spat. "It's an asset, and right now, it's an asset being held hostage by a manipulative granddaughter." Mr. Henderson was scribbling furiously in a notepad, his eyes darting around the room like a lizard spotting flies. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a con artist. He had a gold watch that looked fake and shoes that were scuffed at the toes. "You have 5 minutes to leave," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline, "or I am calling the police for trespassing." Elizabeth laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Trespassing in my parents' house. Good luck with that." But she motioned to Mason and Mr. Henderson. "Come on, we've seen enough." "It's worse than I thought. We'll need a full crew to clear out this junk." As they walked out, Mason bumped my shoulder hard, knocking me back a step. "Better start packing, Emma. Clock's ticking." I watched them leave, my heart pounding in my ears. They weren't just fishing for money anymore. They were planning a takeover. Mr. Henderson was clearly not a legitimate lawyer, which meant they were looking for loopholes outside the law. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. They thought they were dealing with the quiet, submissive Emma who just wanted everyone to get along. They didn't realize that the grief had burned that version of me away. I pulled out my phone and dialed Charles. "They brought a consultant to the house," I said as soon as he answered. "They're inventorying items to sell." "Stay calm, Emma," Charles said. "The trust is active, the deed is recorded. Let them posture. They can't sell what they don't own." "I know," I said, watching Elizabeth's car disappear down the street. "But they don't know that yet, and I have a feeling they're about to try something stupid." I didn't know how right I was. The invasion of my home by Elizabeth and her consultant wasn't just an annoyance, it was a declaration of intent. My hands were still trembling an hour after they left, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that was beginning to solidify in my gut. I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I walked straight into my grandfather's study, the room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and sat at his heavy oak desk. This was where he had managed his affairs for 50 years. It was where he had taught me to balance a checkbook, where he had shown me the importance of meticulous record-keeping. "Okay, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room. "Show me what I need." I opened my laptop and started digging. My profession as an archivist wasn't just about dusting off old books. It was about finding patterns in chaos, about tracing ownership through centuries of obfuscation, about verifying authenticity. I knew how to navigate public records better than most lawyers. First, I looked up Mr. Henderson. I had caught a glimpse of his business card when he flashed it: Henderson and Associates, Asset Recovery. A quick search on the state's business registry showed the LLC had been formed 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over. No website, no reviews, just a shell company. Strike one. Next, I looked up Elizabeth's realtor friend she had mentioned. I remembered the name from a voicemail, Karen something. I searched Elizabeth's social media friends list. Karen Miller. Licensed realtor, yes, but her license was currently suspended for failure to disclose property defects. Strike two, then I went deeper. I pulled up the county property records for the house. The deed transfer to the Arthur and Rose Memorial Trust had been recorded that morning. It was official. The house wasn't mine. It belonged to a legal entity that I controlled but didn't technically own. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a pending application for a quitclaim deed filed just hours ago. The applicant, Elizabeth Miller; the grantee, Mason Miller. My heart hammered against my ribs. A quitclaim deed is a fast way to transfer property, often used between family members. It doesn't guarantee the title is clear, but it clouds the ownership. If they filed this, and if a clerk wasn't paying attention, or if they forged my signature. I called Grace immediately. "They're trying to steal the house," I said, my voice tight. "They filed a quitclaim deed, today." "How?" Grace asked, the sound of typing furious in the background. "They need your signature to transfer it from you to them." "That's just it," I said, staring at the screen. "I didn't sign anything, which means—" "Forgery," Grace finished for me. "They forged your signature." "Or they found a notary who didn't check ID," I added. "Elizabeth knows people, shady people." "Okay," Grace said, her voice turning professional. "We need proof. We need to see that document. Can you get a copy?" "I'm going down to the county clerk's office right now," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive was a blur. When I arrived at the sterile government building, I felt like I was walking into battle. I paid the expedite fee and requested a copy of the pending filing. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, ironic, handed me a crisp photocopy. There it was. Grantor, Emma last name. Grantee, Mason Miller. Signature of grantor. A scrawled, shaky signature that looked vaguely like mine, but with a loop on the E I never made. And the notary stamp. Peter Henderson, the consultant. I almost laughed out loud in the middle of the office. They were so arrogant, so sloppy. They had used their own fake consultant to notarize a forged deed. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the clerk asked, noticing my expression. "No," I said, carefully folding the document and placing it in my bag. "Actually, this is exactly what I needed." I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a hunter. They had just handed me a loaded gun. 2 days later, the official notice arrived. It was taped to my front door, a brightly colored eviction notice, printed on cheap paper with a lot of bold text and exclamation points. Notice to vacate. To Emma last name from Mason Miller, property owner. You are hereby notified that your occupancy of the premises AT address is terminated effective immediately. You have 72 hours to vacate the property and remove all personal belongings. Failure to comply will result in legal action and removal by law enforcement. It was almost comical. A legal eviction takes months. A notice to vacate usually gives 30 days. 72 hours was the timeline of a desperate bully, not a property owner. I pulled the tape off the door, careful not to tear the paper. This was evidence. I went inside and waited. I knew they wouldn't be able to resist a victory lap. Sure enough, around 4:00 p.m., Elizabeth's car rolled into the driveway again. This time, Mason was driving and he parked right on the grass, the tires digging ruts into the lawn my grandfather had meticulously manicured for decades. They got out, looking triumphant. Elizabeth was wearing sunglasses and carrying a clipboard. Mason had a smirk that looked pasted on. I met them on the porch. I didn't invite them in. I stood with my arms crossed, blocking the door. "Did you get our little note?" Elizabeth asked sweetly, pulling her sunglasses down to peer at me. "I did," I said, holding up the neon paper. "It's very colorful." "It's legally binding," Mason said, puffing out his chest. "I own this place now. My name is on the deed." "We filed it with the county." "Is that so?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Because last I checked, I inherited this house." "And you signed it over," Elizabeth lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "Don't you remember, that night after the funeral? You were so distraught, so overwhelmed. You said you didn't want the burden. You signed the quitclaim deed right at the kitchen table." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the audacity. "You are insane," I said quietly. "I never signed anything." "Memory is a tricky thing when you're grieving, honey," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But Mr. Henderson notarized it. We have the witnesses. It's done, you're out." "By Friday," Mason added, checking his watch as if he had somewhere better to be. "Noon." "We're changing the locks then." "You really think I'd let that happen?" I asked, allowing a small, cold smile to touch my lips. "You really think I'm that stupid?" Elizabeth's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me." "You filed a fraudulent deed," I said, stepping closer. "With a forged signature, notarized by a man who isn't even a licensed notary in this state," I checked. "Peter Henderson's commission expired in 2019 in Ohio. He doesn't exist here." Elizabeth's face went pale beneath her makeup. Mason took a step back, his bravado flickering. "You're lying," Mason stammered. "He's a professional." "He's a con artist," I corrected. "And so are you. Do you know what the penalty is for filing a false instrument with a government office? It's a felony, Mason. Up to 5 years in prison." "You can't prove anything." Elizabeth shrieked, her composure cracking. "It's your word against ours. We have the document." "I have the document too," I said. "And I have handwriting experts ready to testify that the signature is a clumsy forgery. And more importantly," I leaned in, dropping my voice to a whisper, "I have something you didn't count on." "What?" Elizabeth hissed. "I'm not the owner of this house," I said. They both froze. "What are you talking about?" Mason asked. "The house belongs to the Arthur and Rose Memorial Trust," I said, savoring the confusion on their faces. "I transferred it days ago, before your little forgery was even filed. You can't quitclaim a property you don't own to begin with." "You tried to steal a house from a ghost, Elizabeth." Silence, absolute stunned silence. A bird chirped in the distance, sounding mockery. Then Elizabeth's face turned a mottled red. You bitch, you tricked us." "I protected my family," I said. "Now get off my porch. If you come back before Friday, I'm calling the police." "We're not going anywhere," Mason yelled, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "We're moving in on Friday. Try and stop us." "Fine," I said, stepping back inside and closing the door in their faces. "Friday it is." I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the door, my heart racing. I had played my hand, but I knew the game wasn't over. They were desperate now, and desperate people do dangerous things. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Elizabeth didn't retreat. She doubled down. She started posting on Facebook, long, rambling rants about how I was stealing her inheritance and dishonoring her parents. She tagged me, my friends, even my employer. My niece has manipulated my dying father and cut me out of my own childhood home. Please, friends, pray for justice. Comments poured in from her friends, people who didn't know the truth, calling me a snake and a gold digger. It hurt, seeing my name dragged through the mud, but I didn't engage. I screenshotted everything. Exhibit C, harassment and defamation. Then came the physical escalation. Wednesday night, I heard a loud crash in the backyard. I rushed to the window and saw Mason and two of his friends throwing my grandfather's garden tools over the fence. They were laughing, beer cans in hand. "Hey!" I shouted through the window. "Get out of here." "It's my yard," Mason slurred, throwing a rake into the bushes. "I'm just clearing out the trash." I called the non-emergency line, but by the time a patrol car rolled by, they were gone. The officer, a young guy named Officer Davis, looked sympathetic but weary. "Without direct proof or damage to the property, it's a civil dispute, ma'am," he said, handing me a card. "But keep a log. If they come back, call us immediately." "They're coming back Friday," I told him. "With movers, they threatened to break in." Officer Davis frowned. "If they try to enter the home forcefully, that's breaking and entering. Call 911. I nodded. "I will." Thursday was the eye of the storm. I spent the day meeting with Charles and Grace. We finalized the affidavit for the forgery. Charles had already contacted the district attorney's office regarding the fraudulent filing. "They've dug their own grave," Charles said, looking over the forged deed. "This is open and shut fraud, but we need them to actually attempt the eviction to nail them for the full intent. So I have to let them come." I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. "You have to let them try," Charles corrected. "You stay inside, you keep the doors locked. Let them be the aggressors. We'll have the police on standby." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the street. Around 2:00 a.m., a car drove by slowly, Elizabeth's sedan. It stopped for a moment, then sped off. They were circling, like vultures. Friday morning dawned gray and overcast. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity. I dressed in simple clothes, jeans, and a sweater, and made a pot of coffee. I sat on the porch swing, a mug in my hand, and waited. At 11:55 a.m., a large moving truck rumbled down the street. My heart skipped a beat. They had actually hired movers. They were that delusional. Behind the truck was Elizabeth's car, and behind that, Mason's beat-up Honda. It was a convoy, an invasion force. The truck parked in front of the house, blocking the driveway. Two burly men in coveralls jumped out. Elizabeth and Mason emerged from their cars, looking victorious. Elizabeth was wearing a bright red power suit, as if she were closing a business deal. Mason was filming on his phone, likely for his followers. "All right, boys," Elizabeth shouted, clapping her hands. "Start with the living room furniture. Everything goes to the storage unit." The movers looked at me sitting on the porch, then at Elizabeth. One of them hesitated. "Ma'am, someone is sitting there." "Ignore her," Elizabeth said loudly. "She's leaving right now." She marched up the walkway, her heels clicking on the pavement like gunshots. Mason followed, still filming. "Time S up, Emma." Mason called out, "Pack your bags." I didn't move. I took a sip of my coffee. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. "I own this house." Mason yelled, waving a piece of paper, the forged deed. "I have the deed right here. Now get out of my way before I physically remove you." "Touch me and you go to jail for assault," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Elizabeth stepped up onto the first step of the porch. "Don't tempt him. Just give us the keys, Emma. It's over. You lost." "Did I asked, "or did you just walk into a trap?" I pulled my phone out of my pocket and pressed a single button. "Officer Davis." I said into the receiver, loud enough for them to hear. "They're here. They're attempting to break in." Elizabeth's eyes went wide. She looked over her shoulder. From the end of the block, two police cruisers that had been parked just out of sight turned on their lights. No sirens, just the silent, flashing blue and red lights of consequences arriving. The movers saw the cops first. "Whoa, lady," one of them said, backing away from the truck. "You said this was a standard move-out. We don't do domestic disputes." "It's not a dispute," Elizabeth screeched, pointing at me. "She's squatting, arrest her." The cruisers pulled up to the curb, blocking the moving truck in. Officer Davis stepped out, along with 3 other officers. "Everyone stay where you are," Officer Davis commanded. Mason lowered his phone, his face draining of color. "Mom, what's going on?" "Nothing," Elizabeth snapped. "They're here to help us kick her out." She turned to the officers with her best fake smile. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. My niece is refusing to vacate my son's property. We have the deed right here." She thrust the forged paper at Officer Davis. He didn't take it. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Elizabeth Miller?" he asked. "Yes," she beamed. "That's me." "And Mason Miller?" "Yeah," Mason said, his voice cracking. Officer Davis pulled a folded warrant from his vest. "You're both under arrest for forgery, filing a false instrument, and attempted grand larceny." The smile fell off Elizabeth's face so fast it was almost audible. "What?" she whispered. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Davis said, reaching for his cuffs. "No," Elizabeth screamed, backing away. "This is a mistake. She's lying. That's my house. My daddy built it." Mason tried to run. He actually turned and bolted toward the backyard. But another officer was already there, tackling him onto the perfectly manicured lawn my grandfather loved so much. "Mom," Mason yelled as he was handcuffed. "You said this was legal. You said Henderson fixed it." "Shut up, Mason," Elizabeth shrieked as Officer Davis spun her around and clicked the cuffs onto her wrists. I stood up from the porch swing. I walked to the railing and looked down at them. Elizabeth looked up at me, her hair disheveled, her expensive suit twisted. Her eyes were wild with fear and hatred. "You did this." She spat. "You ungrateful little witch." "No, Aunt Elizabeth," I said softly. "You did this. You got greedy, you got sloppy, and you forgot that Grandpa didn't raise a fool." I held up the certified copy of the trust document. "The house has been in a trust since Tuesday," I said. "You tried to steal something that didn't exist." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She slumped in the officer's grip, defeated. The movers were already closing the back of their truck. "We're out of here," the driver yelled, jumping into the cab. "Keep the deposit, lady." I watched as they were loaded into the back of the police cars. Mason was crying. Elizabeth was staring blankly ahead, her world crumbling around her. As the cars drove away, the silence returned to the neighborhood. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I took a deep breath of the cool air. The siege was over. The aftermath of their arrest was not the quiet end I had hoped for. Instead, it was a thunderclap that echoed through our small community. News travels fast in a town like ours, especially when police cars are involved in a high-profile eviction. But the true climax wasn't the arrest itself. It was the legal reckoning that followed, and the final, public dismantling of Elizabeth's facade. 3 days after the arrest, I received a call from Charles. "They've made bail," he said, his voice grim. Elizabeth put up her car, and I suspect Mason dipped into whatever crypto funds he had left. "They're out." My stomach tightened. "Are they coming back here?" "The restraining order is in effect," Charles assured me. "If they step within 500 feet of the property, they go straight back to jail, do not pass go. But Emma, Elizabeth isn't done. She's called a family meeting. She's rallying the extended relatives. She's claiming you framed her, that the trust documents are forgeries you created to steal the house after she legally claimed it." "She's delusional," I said, pacing my living room. "She's desperate," Charles corrected. "And she's persuasive. She's hosting a dinner tonight at that Italian place on Main Street. She's invited your cousins, your great-aunt, everyone. She intends to spin a narrative that paints you as the villain before the court date." I stopped pacing. I looked at the photo of my grandparents on the mantel, Grandpa in his fishing hat, Grandma laughing at something he said. They hated conflict. They hated gossip, but they hated lies even more. "Let her have her dinner," I said, a cold resolve settling over me. I'll be there. Emma, Charles warned, that's walking into the lion's den. No, I said, grabbing my purse and the thick file folder Grace had prepared for me. It's walking into a courtroom, and I'm bringing the evidence. The restaurant was bustling when I arrived. I saw them immediately, a long table in the back, dominated by Elizabeth holding court. She looked haggard, her makeup a little too heavy to hide the stress lines, but her voice was loud and performative. Mason sat next to her, looking sullen and picking at a breadstick. Around them sat my cousins, a few aunts I rarely saw, and even Great-Aunt Mildred, who was nodding sympathetically as Elizabeth spoke. And can you believe it? Elizabeth was saying, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. My own niece, calling the police on her flesh and blood, all because she couldn't handle the fact that Daddy wanted me to have the house. She forged those trust papers, I know it. We have a witness. The table murmured in agreement. Terrible, someone whispered. Poor Elizabeth. I walked up to the table. Silence rippled outward from where I stood, cutting through the restaurant chatter like a knife. Hello, everyone, I said, my voice clear and steady. Elizabeth jumped, nearly knocking over her wine glass. You, she hissed. You have some nerve showing your face here. This is a private family dinner. It's a public restaurant, Elizabeth, I said calmly. And since you're discussing me, I thought I should clarify a few things. We don't want to hear your lies, Mason shouted, standing up. Get lost, Emma. Sit down, Mason, I said, not even looking at him. I kept my eyes locked on Elizabeth. I'm not here to argue, I'm here to show you something. I placed the file folder on the table. What is this? Great-Aunt Mildred asked, peering at it through her thick glasses. That, I said, opening the folder, is the report from the forensic document examiner regarding the quitclaim deed you filed, Elizabeth. It confirms, with 99% certainty, that the signature Emma last name was not written by me. Elizabeth scoffed, though her hand trembled as she reached for her wine. You paid someone to say that. I also have this, I continued, pulling out another sheet. A sworn affidavit from the real Peter Henderson in Ohio. He states he has never been to this state, never met you, and certainly never notarized a deed for you. He's suing you for identity theft. Gasps went around the table. My cousin Sarah picked up the paper, her eyes widening. Wait, this says the notary stamp was ordered online from a novelty shop. And finally, I said, pulling out the piece de resistance, a printout of a text conversation. This is a transcript of texts between Mason and his friend who works at the print shop. Date, 3 days before the eviction attempt. Mason asks, Hey bro, can you make a deed look official if I send you the template? Mom needs it for the house. Mason turned white. He looked at his mother, panic in his eyes. Mom, you said you deleted those. The room went dead silent. Even the waiters stopped moving. Elizabeth stared at the transcript, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The narrative she had been spinning for hours, for weeks, collapsed in an instant. It was a misunderstanding. Elizabeth stammered, looking around the table for support. We were just trying to expedite things. Daddy wanted me to have the house. Emma manipulated him. Arthur didn't want you anywhere near that house, Liz, Great-Aunt Mildred said sharply, her voice cutting through the excuses. He told me himself last Christmas. He said you only called when you needed money. He said Emma was the only one who cared about them, not their wallet. Elizabeth looked at her aunt, stunned. That's not true, he loved me. He loved you, I said softly, but he didn't trust you. And this, I gestured to the pile of incriminating documents, is exactly why. I looked around the table. The sympathy had evaporated. In its place was shock, disgust, and pity. My cousins were looking at their phones, avoiding eye contact. Great-Aunt Mildred was shaking her head in disappointment. I'm pressing charges for the forgery and the attempted fraud, I announced to the table. The police already have copies of all of this. I just wanted you to hear the truth from me, not the fairy tale Elizabeth has been selling you. I turned to leave, but Elizabeth stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. You think you've won. She screamed, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face. Real tears this time, tears of rage and humiliation. You think because you have some papers you're better than me. You're nothing. You're a lonely, pathetic spinster just like your grandmother. My grandmother, I said, turning back to face her one last time, was a woman of integrity. She built a life of love and respect. You have nothing but debt and lies. I looked at Mason. And Mason, I suggest you get a public defender. The friend at the print shop just cut a deal with the DA. Mason dropped his head into his hands. Elizabeth stood frozen, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making. The entire restaurant was watching her. I walked out into the cool night air. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt clean. The poison had been drawn out. The truth was out in the open. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and brutal. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the forensic report, the text messages, the fake notary stamp, Elizabeth's lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted grand larceny. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for my legal fees. Mason, having a clean record and being clearly manipulated by his mother, got a lighter sentence, 2 years probation and mandatory counseling. But the real punishment wasn't the court S. It was the social exile. Elizabeth's reputation in town was destroyed. The real estate career she claimed to have was over before it started. No broker would touch someone with a fraud conviction. She ended up moving 3 towns over, into a small apartment she could barely afford working retail. We haven't spoken since the restaurant. Mason, surprisingly, reached out. About 6 months after the sentencing, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Emma, I don't expect you to forgive me. I was an idiot. Mom told me the house was rightfully ours and that you stole it. I believed her because I wanted the money. I'm sorry. I'm working at a landscaping company now. It's hard work, but it's honest. I hope you're doing okay. Mason. I didn't reply, but I didn't burn it either. I filed it away in the archives, a small footnote in the family history. As for me, I kept the house, but I didn't live in the past. I used the inheritance money exactly as my grandparents would have wanted. I renovated the kitchen, bringing in light and modern appliances while keeping the original charm. I turned the dusty attic into a proper climate-controlled archive for my work, and I started a project. I created the Arthur and Rose Grant for Elder Care. It wasn't huge, but it provided funding for families who couldn't afford in-home care for their aging relatives. I wanted to ensure that other people didn't have to sacrifice their entire lives the way I did, or suffer the isolation my grandparents feared. One afternoon, a year later, I was sitting on the porch swing, the same swing where I had watched the police arrest my family. The garden was blooming, the roses my grandmother loved bursting with color. Grace pulled into the driveway, grinning. She had just passed the bar exam. "Counselor," I greeted her, holding up a glass of lemonade. "Client," she teased back, hopping up the steps. "How's the estate?" "Secure," I smiled. "Quiet, peaceful." We sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You know," Grace said thoughtfully, "most people would have sold this place. Too many bad memories." I looked at the house. I saw the window where I used to read to Grandpa. I saw the kitchen where Grandma taught me to bake. I saw the living room where I had stood my ground against Elizabeth. "The bad memories are just shadows," I said. "The house itself, it's built on love, and I wasn't going to let anyone steal that." I took a sip of lemonade, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on my face. The trust was solid. The family secrets were exposed. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt truly, completely mine.